I am Beatrice. I am 65 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life as an emergency room nurse. I wiped away blood, held the hands of the dying, and worked endless double shifts on my tired feet, just so my only son, Jamal, would never have to know the meaning of the word struggle. I raised him in the church, taught him to respect his elders, and poured every ounce of my soul and every dime of my savings into giving him the world. I always knew his wife was a snake in the grass, but I bit my tongue and let God handle it, trusting that what happens in the dark will always find its way to the light. I watched that woman whisper wicked lies into his ear, turning my own flesh and blood against the mother who gave him life. I thought I had seen the worst of her cruelty, until my phone rang in the dead of night, with my son on the other end, sobbing uncontrollably, confessing a twisted secret that proved she had been hiding an entire second family behind his back. But the ultimate betrayal started exactly 3 weeks ago, on the evening of my 65th birthday dinner. I had spent 2 days marinating a roast and baking the peach cobbler Jamal has loved since he was a little boy. I set the good china on the dining table and wore the blue silk dress I bought specifically for the occasion. When Jamal and his wife Maya finally walked through my front door, 2 hours late, they did not carry a gift or a warm greeting. Maya stepped onto my clean hardwood floors in her muddy designer heels, looked around my living room with a sneer, and crossed her arms. Before Jamal even wished me a happy birthday, he pulled a thick manila folder from his expensive leather briefcase and dropped it right next to my peach cobbler. He could not even look me in the eye when he spoke. He said that Maya felt my house was getting too cluttered for an old woman living alone, and they had taken the liberty of finding me a cheap assisted living facility upstate. He told me to sign the deed of my home over to them by the end of the week so they could knock it down and build a modern rental property. Maya chimed in with a cold laugh, saying I should be grateful they were handling the paperwork because someone of my background could not possibly manage such complex financial matters. She looked me up and down, mocking the dress I wore, and told me that holding on to a house like this was just greedy for a retired nurse who should be preparing for the end of her days. I stood there in my own dining room, the house I paid off with 40 years of broken sleep and aching bones, listening to my own son tell me I was nothing more than an obstacle to his real estate portfolio. I kept my mouth shut and my head high, but as I looked at the boy, I sacrificed everything, for I realized he was no longer my son. He was just a greedy stranger standing in my kitchen, and I knew right then that I was going to teach them both a lesson they would never forget. My Marcus was a good man, but the Lord called him home when Jamal was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. From that day on, it was just the two of us against the world. I worked double shifts in the emergency room, spending 12 to 16 hours on my feet, wiping blood and holding the hands of strangers, all so my son would never have to know the bitter taste of an empty fridge or a past due notice. I poured every ounce of my strength into that boy, and it paid off. Jamal grew into a fine, respectable young man. I paid every penny of his college tuition so he could walk across that stage and take his degree in accounting without a single chain of debt holding him down. We were a team. Every single Sunday, without fail, my boy would come over to the house. The smell of smothered pork chops, collard greens, and sweet potato pie would fill the air. We would sit at the dining table for hours, laughing, talking about his week, and dreaming about his future. Jamal treated me like an absolute queen. He would always bring me a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite, and kiss my cheek, telling me I was the strongest woman he knew. He was my rock, and I was his. We shared an unbreakable bond, forged in the fires of grief and hard work. I truly believed nothing in this world could ever sever the tie between a mother and the son she raised from the ashes. I was so sure of his heart. But a mother's love can sometimes blind her to the harsh realities of the world, especially when that reality walks through the front door wearing a perfect smile. The shift in our lives began on a brisk autumn evening when Jamal brought Chloe home for the first time. He was beaming, looking at her as if she had hung the moon and the stars. On the surface, Chloe was the picture of perfection. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored cream suit, her hair styled flawlessly, and she spoke with a honey-coated politeness that seemed almost too rehearsed. But after 40 years of reading people in the emergency room, my intuition was razor-sharp. I saw the way her eyes darted around my home. She was not looking at the family photos or the warmth of the living room. She was assessing the crown, molding the hardwood floors, and the antique furniture. She was calculating my net worth while sipping my sweet tea. It did not take long for the passive-aggressive remarks to start. She made slight comments about my outdated boundaries, suggesting that Sunday dinners were a bit old-fashioned and that independent couples needed more space. I brushed it off, wanting to see the best in the woman my son loved. Then I met Rebecca. Rebecca was a white American woman, Chloe's adoptive sister, who accompanied them to dinner a few weeks later. The dynamic between them was deeply unsettling. Rebecca was quiet. Her shoulders hunched constantly, wringing her hands in her lap. She looked at Chloe with a mixture of fear and obedience, always walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing. Whenever Rebecca tried to speak, Chloe would cut her off with a sharp, dismissive tone, treating her more like an unwanted servant than a sister. Seeing a woman treat her own family with such cold disdain sent a shiver down my spine. It was a massive red flag waving right in front of my face, a warning of the cruelty Chloe was capable of. But I kept my peace, praying my son would see the truth on his own. But Jamal did not see the truth. Instead, the poison slowly began to seep into his mind, drop by drop. The emotional distance crept in like a shadow. Our weekly Sunday dinners became bi-weekly, then monthly, until they stopped altogether. Jamal would call me rushing off the phone, making vague excuses about being swamped at the accounting firm. But I knew the real reason. Chloe was actively filling his head with the most wicked lies imaginable. First, she told Jamal that I had insulted her cooking during a private conversation, a conversation that never happened. Then she claimed I had criticized her background and made her feel unwelcome in my home. The final blow came when she actually accused me of stealing a diamond bracelet from her purse during one of their brief visits. My own son, the boy I bled for, called me demanding I return it. He was completely blinded by her manipulation wrapped so tightly around her finger that he could not recognize his own mother's character. The ultimate heartbreak arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Jamal stood on my porch, refusing to even step inside, and told me he needed space. He looked at the ground, repeating Chloe's words as if he had memorized a script. He said my toxic behavior was ruining his marriage and causing his wife severe anxiety. He told me I needed to respect their boundaries and stop trying to control his life. My heart shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces right there on the welcome mat. I wanted to scream, to shake him and ask where his mind had gone. But I am a woman of faith and pride. I refused to beg for the love of a man who could discard me so easily. I simply nodded, told him I loved him, and closed the door. I chose to step back with quiet dignity, trusting that God would eventually expose the serpent he had brought into his home. The next 6 months were the quietest of my entire life. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears and settles heavy in your bones, making the whole house feel like a museum of a life that used to be. I had always been used to the noise of an emergency room, the constant beeping of monitors, the rush of footsteps, and the loud, joyous laughter of my son, filling my living room on Sunday afternoons. Without Jamal, the house was painfully still. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge's gavel, reminding me of the time slipping away between us. To keep my mind from wandering into dark places, I filled the empty hours with the soil in my backyard. I planted beefsteak tomatoes, collard greens squash, and bright yellow marigolds. I dug my bare hands deep into the damp earth, just to feel something real, something rooted and alive. My garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could pour my energy and watch things grow, instead of watching them wither away. Every Sunday morning I put on my best hat and walked into my church, taking my usual seat in the third pew. The ladies in the choir and the usher board would naturally ask about Jamal. I would just smile brightly, pat their hands, and say he was doing just fine, busy building his new life. I never let a single one of them see the deep crack in my heart. But the good Lord knew the truth. Every single night, I dropped down on my worn knees beside my bed and prayed for my boy. I prayed for his protection, for his blind eyes to be opened, and for that wicked woman's true colours to wash out in the rain. The emotional toll of a mother missing her only child is a heavy, suffocating cross to bear. There were days I picked up my telephone, my thumb hovering over his name, desperate to hear his voice, even if it was just to hear him argue with me. But I always put the phone back down. I am a woman of dignity and faith. I worked too hard, scrubbed too many hospital floors, and sacrificed too much of my youth to beg for the affection of a boy I raised to be a man. I knew that chasing after him, crying and pleading, would only give Chloe the exact satisfaction she was looking for. She wanted me to be the frantic, overbearing mother-in-law she had painted me out to be. I refused to give her that victory. So I waited in the silence, tending to my garden, baking my pies, and keeping my house spotless. I knew the storm was coming. You cannot build a foundation on lies and expect the house to stand forever. I just had to be patient and let the foundation crumble completely on its own. The turning point arrived exactly when I stopped waiting for it. It was a Tuesday night, and the rain was lashing against my bedroom window. At 2:45 in the morning, the shrill ring of my telephone shattered the quiet dark. After 40 years as a nurse, a phone ringing in the dead of night instantly sends a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. I grabbed the receiver before the third ring, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was Jamal. He was not just crying. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air like a drowning man. The sound of my strong, successful son completely falling apart terrified me to my core. I commanded him to breathe, using the same firm, steady voice I used to calm panicked patients in the trauma ward. Slowly, between ragged sobs, the horrific truth began to spill out of him. He explained that Chloe had gone out of town for a supposed marketing conference. Jamal had stayed behind, working late on some client accounts. He went into Chloe's home office to look for a specific tax document she claimed she had filed away in her desk. While searching through her bottom drawer, he noticed the wooden panel felt loose. He pulled on it, and the false bottom popped out, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside that compartment was a reality he was completely unprepared for. Jamal found a stack of out-of-state bank statements and a cheap prepaid burner phone. He opened the bank statements first, and his blood ran cold. They were accounts solely in Chloe's name, registered to an address in Georgia, showing massive deposits being made every single month. But the true devastation came when he picked up the burner phone. He pressed the power button, watching the screen light up with a cheap logo. He barely had time to process the dozens of unread text messages before the phone started vibrating in his hand. The caller ID simply read, "Home." With trembling fingers, Jamal answered the call and pressed the phone to his ear. He did not say a word. He just listened. On the other end of the line, a little boy's voice rang out, bright and eager but laced with a whimpering cry. The child said, "Daddy, when is Mummy coming home with the money?" Jamal stood frozen in Chloe's office, feeling the floor drop out from underneath his feet. Before he could even process the sound of that child, the phone rustled and a deep, gruff man's voice took over the line. The man angrily demanded to know who the hell was breathing on the phone and why a stranger was answering his wife's private number. Jamal dropped the phone on the desk as if it had burned his skin. He backed away, his mind spinning violently. He was married to a woman who did not just have secrets. She had an entire separate life, a husband and a child waiting for her in another state. All the late nights at the office, the sudden business trips, the demand for absolute privacy regarding her finances, it all snapped into brutal, terrifying focus. He was not a husband to her. He was a target. He was a bankroll. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping the phone cord so tightly my knuckles turned white, listening to the sheer devastation in my son's voice. The wicked woman had brought a storm into my son's life, a storm of unimaginable deceit. I felt a surge of righteous anger burning hot in my chest, but I kept my voice perfectly level. I listened as he described staring at the bank statements again, realizing that the massive deposits matched the exact amounts that had been draining from his own business accounts over the past year. Chloe had been systematically funneling his hard-earned money across state lines to fund her real family. Jamal broke down completely over the line, his sobs echoing in the quiet of my bedroom. The heavy veil of manipulation had been lifted, and the blinding light of the truth was agonizing for him to look at. He realized in that dark office that Chloe had completely fabricated her entire existence. Everything she had ever told him was a calculated, venomous lie, and the most painful realization of all was understanding exactly why she had targeted me. The lies about my toxic behavior, the accusations of me insulting her, the fabricated story about the stolen jewelry. It was all a deliberate, masterful strategy to isolate him. She knew that as long as Jamal had his mother looking out for him, as long as my seasoned eyes were watching her moves, she would never be able to get away with her scheme. She had to sever his strongest support system to leave him entirely vulnerable and alone, while she drained his joint accounts dry. He told me that he had just checked his main savings, the money he had been putting away since his first accounting job, and it was nearly empty. She had taken almost everything. Over the phone, my son wept like a child begging for my forgiveness. He apologized for turning his back on me, for believing a stranger's lies over the woman who gave him life, and for bringing such a wicked evil into our family. He told me he was so ashamed of how he had treated me at my birthday dinner, ashamed that he had handed me that assisted living brochure, ashamed that he had let her disrespect my home. I closed my eyes and swallowed the massive lump of pain and pride in my throat. This was not the time for me to say I told you so. This was not the time to demand apologies or dwell on my own broken heart. My son was bleeding, and I am an emergency room nurse. The fierce motherly protector instinct kicked into high gear, completely washing away the 6 months of agonizing silence and rejection. I sat up straight, my voice ringing out with absolute, unshakable authority. I told him to stop crying. I told him to dry his tears right this second because panic never solved a crisis. I instructed him to leave the burner phone and the bank statements exactly where he found them, to wipe his fingerprints off the desk, and to pack a single overnight bag. I ordered him to walk out the front door, lock it behind him, and drive straight to my house immediately. I promised him that we were going to fix this, that no weapon formed against our family was going to prosper, and that Chloe was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to destroy a mother's only child. I hung up the phone, walked into my kitchen, and put on a pot of strong black coffee. The tears were gone. The waiting was over. My boy was coming home, and we had a war to win. I walked through my quiet living room, turning on every single light in the house, until it blazed like a beacon in the stormy night. I pulled out my own lockbox of documents and set them on the dining table, the very same table where he had insulted me just weeks prior. That did not matter now. What mattered was survival. I knew the legal battles ahead would be brutal, and I knew she would try to fight back. But she had absolutely no idea the kind of strength she was up against. I am a woman who spent 40 years pulling people back from the brink of death. I know how to stop the bleeding, and I know how to cut out the poison. By the time I saw the headlights of his car pulling into my driveway, I was standing on the front porch, waiting for him. When Jamal walked through my front door, he looked like a broken child. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were swollen, and the heavy rain had soaked right through his expensive designer coat. He collapsed into my arms, weeping into my shoulder, just like he did when he scraped his knee as a little boy. But this was not the time for tears, and this was not the time for pity. I had spent 40 years in the emergency room, and I knew that when a patient is bleeding out on the table, you do not sit down and cry with them. You apply pressure, you stop the bleeding, and you get to work. I guided my son to the kitchen table, the very same oak table where he had sat just weeks prior, and handed me that insulting assisted living brochure. I pushed him down into a chair. I did not ask him how he felt, and I did not offer him empty words of comfort. I turned around, brewed a pot of the strongest black coffee I had in my pantry, and pulled out a fresh yellow notepad. I slammed a steaming mug down in front of him and told him to drink the coffee and dry his eyes, because we had serious work to do. By sunrise, we were sitting in the downtown office of a private investigator. I did not want some amateur who just searched internet records. I wanted a seasoned professional, a man who knew exactly how to dig up the dirty secrets that people try to bury deep under concrete. I handed the investigator the burner phone number and the details from the out-of-state bank statements Jamal had found hidden in her desk. I paid his exorbitant retainer in cash, straight from my emergency savings, and told him I wanted every single shadow of Chloe's life brought into the blinding light of day. It took the investigator exactly 3 days to unravel a web of lies so thick and so evil it would make the devil himself dizzy. We sat in my living room when he delivered his final report, and the unfiltered truth hit us like a runaway freight train. Chloe was not her real name. She was legally married to a man in Ohio, a man who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to some very dangerous underground bookies. She was not a successful marketing executive with a glowing resume. She was a professional con artist who had specifically targeted my son for his lucrative accounting firm and his pristine credit score. But the most sickening revelation of all was the children. The little boy Jamal had heard crying on the burner phone was her 6-year-old son, and she had an 8-year-old daughter as well. She had abandoned her own flesh and blood in Ohio, with her degenerate husband funneling my son's hard-earned money across state lines just to pay off those massive gambling debts. Every late night at the office, every supposed business trip to Chicago or New York, she was actually traveling back to Ohio to drop off cash and keep the loan sharks at bay. She had played my son like a cheap fiddle, using his kind heart and his trusting nature to fund a massive criminal enterprise. My son sat beside me, his face completely pale, staring at the glossy photographs the investigator had printed out. Pictures of the woman he called his wife, hugging another man, kissing the children she had kept entirely hidden from him. He was completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her betrayal. But I was not paralyzed. I was calculating our next move. I looked at the investigator and asked for one more vital piece of the puzzle. I needed to know every single detail about the quiet, nervous white woman Chloe claimed was her adoptive sister. The investigator smiled a grim smile, and slid another thick folder across my dining table. He explained that Rebecca was indeed related to Chloe by marriage, but she was not a willing participant in this grand scheme. She was a pawn trapped in Chloe's web, just like my son. Hearing this, my mind started working faster than it had in years. I thanked the investigator, locked the front door, and turned to Jamal. I told him that Chloe thought she was the smartest person in the room, but she had made one fatal miscalculation. She forgot that he had a mother who spent a lifetime dealing with crisis. I knew immediately that Rebecca was the weak link in Chloe's impenetrable armor. I remembered how terrified she looked at our Sunday family dinners, how she flinched every time Chloe raised her voice, and how her eyes always darted to the exits like a trapped animal desperate for an escape route. I told Jamal that if we wanted to tear this entire criminal operation down to the studs, we had to start by removing the support beams. We tracked Rebecca down to a dingy little diner on the edge of town where she worked her day job as a waitress. Jamal and I walked in right before her shift ended, taking a booth in the far back corner where the fluorescent lights flickered dimly. When Rebecca walked over to our table to hand us a menu, she took one look at my face and all the color completely drained from her cheeks. Her hands began to shake, and she tried to turn around and run back to the kitchen, but I stood up and blocked her path. I did not yell. I did not cause a public scene. I simply used my firm, authoritative nurse voice, the exact same tone I used when a patient was lying to me about their symptoms or trying to leave the hospital against medical advice. I told her to sit down in the booth, keep her hands flat on the table, and listen very carefully to what I had to say. She slid into the vinyl seat across from Jamal, trembling from head to toe, her eyes wide with panic. I leaned in close and laid the investigator's photographs flat on the table, placing them right next to the salt and pepper shakers. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as she realized we knew absolutely everything about the husband, the abandoned children, and the gambling debts. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that she had two very clear choices. She could either ride this sinking ship all the way to a federal prison for conspiracy and wire fraud, or she could tell me every single detail of Chloe's endgame right now. The threat of losing her freedom and going to prison broke her instantly. Rebecca burst into heavy tears right there in the diner, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. She confessed everything without holding a single detail back. She told us that Chloe had mercilessly forced her to play along with the fake identity, threatening to ruin her life and expose her secrets if she refused. Rebecca had drowning medical debts from a severe past illness, and Chloe had promised to pay them off completely in exchange for her silence and her active participation in the charade. Rebecca sobbed, telling us she felt physically sick with guilt every time she looked at Jamal, knowing the absolute financial devastation Chloe was causing him. But then Rebecca provided the final nail in the coffin. She wiped her red eyes with a paper napkin and looked at Jamal with pure, unadulterated pity. She explained that Chloe's ultimate plan was nearing its final destructive stage. Chloe had recently forged highly sophisticated documents for a massive fake business investment. She was planning to present these deceptive papers to Jamal the following week, claiming it was a once-in-a-lifetime commercial real estate opportunity that would secure their financial future forever. In reality, those documents were a direct legal authorization to transfer his entire life savings, his accounting business assets, and the hard-earned equity from their marital home into an untraceable offshore account. Once Jamal signed that paper, his money would vanish instantly, and Chloe would disappear right along with it, returning to Ohio and leaving him completely bankrupt, utterly humiliated, and legally responsible for the catastrophic fallout. Jamal looked like he was going to be physically sick right there in the booth. He ran a hand over his face, realizing he had almost signed his entire existence away to a phantom. but I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire being. Now we had her playbook. Now we knew her timeline. And now we had the power to turn her own trap against her. I sat back in the worn vinyl diner booth and looked at the two terrified young people sitting with me. I realized that simply catching Chloe red-handed and turning her over to the authorities was not nearly enough. After the pain she had caused my son and the blatant disrespect she had shown in my home, I wanted to expose her in a way that would shatter her false reality completely. I devised a brilliant, cold-blooded plan right there over a cup of lukewarm diner coffee. I leaned forward, looked Rebecca dead in the eye, and told her she was going to go back to Chloe and act exactly as she always did. She was to be the quiet, obedient, fearful sister, keeping her head down and her mouth completely shut about our meeting. I promised Rebecca that if she played her part perfectly and helped us execute this plan, I would ensure she walked away from this criminal mess without a pair of handcuffs on her wrists, and I would personally help her figure out a legitimate way to settle her crippling medical debts. She agreed immediately, nodding her head with frantic gratitude and swearing she would not let us down. Then I turned my attention to my son. This was going to be the absolute hardest part of the plan for him to swallow. I told Jamal he had to go back to his house, walk through the front door, and look the devil directly in the face without flinching. He had to play the perfect, doting, clueless husband. He had to kiss her cheek, ask affectionately about her day, and pretend he was completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that his wife was a ghost sent to ruin him. I told him he needed to channel every ounce of deep pain, betrayal, and boiling anger he felt, and bury it deep down in his gut where she could not see it. Jamal was terrified by the prospect. He shook his head and said he did not know if he could physically stomach being in the same room as her, let alone pretend to love her and share a bed with her. I reached across the table, grabbed his hands firmly, and squeezed them hard enough to make him look at me. I reminded him of exactly who he was. I told him he was a survivor raised by a strong black woman who never, ever backed down from a fight or let anyone trample over her family. I told him to smile through the burning disgust, because every single smile was bringing us one step closer to her absolute and public destruction. Our strategy was simple, but utterly devastating. We agreed that Jamal would act absolutely ecstatic when she finally brought up the fake business investment. He would tell Chloe that he had reviewed the papers, found them to be completely flawless, and was incredibly eager and ready to sign everything over to secure their future. But he would insist that a financial milestone this massive required a proper, unforgettable celebration. He was going to book a lavish private dining room at the most upscale, expensive restaurant in the city, inviting only their closest inner circle to witness the official signing of the documents. We would host a magnificent dinner party to supposedly celebrate their incredible new joint venture. Chloe would believe she had finally won the ultimate prize. She would walk into that restaurant wearing a stunning designer dress paid for with my son's stolen money, fully convinced that she was mere days away from disappearing with his entire fortune. She would be so completely blinded by her own bottomless greed and unearned arrogance that she would never see the trap we had set right beneath her perfectly manicured feet. Jamal took a deep, steadying breath, his posture finally straightening up in the diner booth. The broken, weeping child who had shown up on my porch hours ago was gone, replaced by a focused, determined man, ready to reclaim his life and exact his revenge. We walked out of that diner into the cool night air, with a shared, silent determination binding us together. The stage was officially set. The players were perfectly in position. All we had to do now was let the curtain rise on her final, miserable performance. The evening of the dinner arrived with a bitter chill in the air, but a fiery heat in my veins. I waited in the lobby of the most exclusive steakhouse in the city, while Jamal played his part in the private dining room upstairs. According to Jamal, Chloe was dressed to the nines in a custom silk gown she had undoubtedly purchased with the money she had siphoned from his business accounts. She sat across from him with a triumphant gleam in her eye, sipping vintage champagne, and acting like she had just conquered the world. She slid a thick folder across the white tablecloth. It was the fake investment, the ultimate trap designed to drain my son of every last dime he had to his name. Jamal smiled warmly, holding a gold pen, playing the fool exactly as practiced. That was finally my cue to enter. I slowly pushed open the heavy doors and stepped confidently inside. I wore my finest black tailored suit, walking with the unbothered grace of a woman who held all the cards. Chloe gasped, nearly spilling her champagne. Her perfect smile contorted into pure fury as she demanded to know what I was doing there, screeching at Jamal to call security. I did not raise my voice. I simply pulled up a chair, smoothed my skirt, and told her to sit down and be quiet. Jamal looked at her with a deadly calm that would have made his late father proud. He opened the leather folder, but he did not sign his name. Instead, he pulled out the thick stack of documents our private investigator had prepared. He tossed a photograph of Chloe kissing her real husband onto the table. Then he laid down the Ohio marriage certificate. Finally, he scattered the wire transfer receipts, highlighting the massive sums she had been funneling to a state she claimed she had never visited. Chloe turned the color of ash. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and delivered the exact dosage of reality she needed. I spoke with the perfectly steady, chilling tone I used when breaking bad news in the emergency room. I told her that I knew her real name. I told her I knew about the husband she hid in Ohio and the massive underground gambling debts she was trying to pay off. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I even knew about the 2 innocent children she had abandoned just to play a wicked game of playing house with my son. I dismantled every single lie she had ever spoken, laying her entire fraudulent existence bare under the crystal chandelier. She thought she could march into my life, insult my home, tear my family apart, and rob my son blind. I told her she had picked the absolute wrong family and the completely wrong mother to mess with. The absolute panic finally set in. Chloe scrambled from her chair, her designer gown catching on the edge of the table as she tried gathering the scattered documents. When she realized Jamal was looking at her with nothing but pure disgust, she immediately tried to play the victim. Tears streamed down her carefully painted face as she desperately turned to Rebecca, who was sitting quietly at the end of the table. Chloe screamed at her adoptive sister, commanding Rebecca to tell us we were crazy to swear this was all a massive misunderstanding and she was being framed. But Rebecca did not cower. For the first time since I met her, the young woman sat up completely straight. She looked at Chloe with a mixture of pity and newfound courage. Rebecca publicly denounced her right then. She told Chloe she was absolutely done lying for her, done covering up the sick scam, and done carrying the heavy weight of her crimes. Rebecca stated clearly that she had already given a full statement to the authorities and that the game was officially over. Chloe shrieked like a cornered animal and lunged toward the heavy doors, desperate to escape, before her fake world collapsed. But I had already planned for that. I simply raised my hand and signaled the waiter standing by the entrance. The doors swung open wide, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the private dining room, followed closely by a federal detective carrying a thick manila folder of his own. I had coordinated with them all afternoon, handing over every piece of evidence our investigator had compiled. The detective read Chloe her rights, right there over the uneaten steaks and the vintage champagne. She was placed under arrest for felony bigamy, severe identity theft, and multiple counts of wire fraud. The cold, sharp click of the metal handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet room. Chloe wept and begged, thrashing against the officers, but there was no escaping the justice she had brought upon herself. She was escorted out of the private room and marched directly through the main dining area of the crowded upscale restaurant. Hundreds of wealthy patrons stopped their dinners to watch the glamorous con artist being hauled away in disgrace. Once the doors closed behind her, the heavy silence of the room broke. Jamal collapsed into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The strong facade he had maintained all evening shattered, and he began to weep with deep, agonizing sobs. I walked over and pulled my grown son into my arms, holding his head against my chest, just like I did when he was a little boy. He apologized over and over again for ever doubting me, for letting her wicked lies blind him, and for almost losing the mother who had given him everything. I stroked his hair and told him he was forgiven. The storm had finally passed, the poison had been drawn out, and my kingdom was completely restored. A mother's intuition never lies. When you carry a child, raise him, and sacrifice for his future, you know the true rhythm of his heart. I learned that genuine love, the kind forged in faith and quiet strength, cannot be permanently broken by the venom of a selfish stranger. Sometimes the absolute hardest thing for a mother to do is to step back, bite her tongue, and let the storm rage around her. But I am here to tell you that there is a profound, undeniable power in stepping back and letting the truth reveal itself. It is often the strongest and most unshakable move a woman can ever make. I did not have to fight a war for my son's soul. The light simply exposed the darkness, and the darkness ultimately destroyed itself. Today, my home is filled with joy, and my family is whole again. If you have ever had to protect your family from a wolf in sheep's clothing, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me down in the comments where you are watching from today and what time it is there. I love seeing how far our family reaches. Until next time, stay blessed and stay vigilant.